My name is Sahar Bazzaz. I'm the chair of the history department here at Holy Cross, and I'm also a modernist. I work on the Middle East and North Africa. So we'll just dive right in. The final panel for today is entitled Crusades Then and Now, which of course is, I think, really apropos for a variety of reasons. And our first panelist or discussant today will be Dr. Suleiman Mourad, who was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and received his college education at the American University of Beirut in math and history, and earned his doctorate at Yale University in Arabic and Islamic studies. And since 2005, he's lived in Northampton, Massachusetts with his family, where he teaches at Smith College as the Myra M. Sampson Professor of Religion. His courses focus on Islamic history, religious thought, law and culture, and on comparative themes. He is the recipient of a number of awards, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Institut d'études avancées de Nantes in France, the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung and Gerda Henkel Stiftung in Germany. And he's also served as a historical consultant for several film documentaries in the US and Europe, including Jerusalem, City of Faith and Fury, The Sultan and the Saint, so the first one CNN, second one PBS, and Jesus et l'Islam, which is Art TV, French. His research focuses on Muslims as makers and interpreters of their own religious, historical, and legal traditions. And his publications include The Mosaic of Islam, with Verso in 2016, the Routledge Handbook on Jerusalem, 2019, and Muslim Sources of the Crusader Period, Hackett, 2021, and many other books and articles. And he also occasionally is an op-ed writer on historical and current issues in various media. So without further ado, he will be presenting to you A Clash of Civilizations, a revisionist reading of the history of Muslim-Frankish encounters in the Crusader period.
Thank you, Professor Bazzaz, for this generous introduction. Thank you, Amanda, for inviting me to take part in this distinguished lineup of great scholars, great colleagues. Thank you all. And also thanks for all the people behind the scenes who made this possible for us to come here and to share this extremely stimulating and rich conversation. I just as a context, knowing what Matt is going to be saying, I'm going to be largely focusing my remarks on the pre-modern period and how that can help us rethink a new narrative of the Crusades, of the Crusader period, Crusader encounters, that is less prone to be radicalized. One regularly encounters the trope of the clash of civilizations or religions when watching or reading about Christian-Muslim encounters during the Crusader period. For instance, in November 2016, Al Jazeera TV released a 4-part documentary on the Crusades, which was inspired by documentaries produced by the History Channel in 2005, The Crusades, Crescent and the Cross, and BBC, The Crusades in 2012. All 3 documentaries show how the media sensationalizes history and disseminates particular views to the level that they become edifices of social beliefs, culture, and politics. The first episode of Al Jazeera's documentary, titled The Shock, is introduced in this way. And let me play it for you so that you can get an idea.
In the history of conflict between East and West, the mightiest battle between Christianity and Islam, a holy war in the name of religion. for the first time, the story of the Crusades from an Arab perspective.
So that gives you an idea about the pitch for this documentary. The documentary, this was accompanied by a written précis that emphasizes the atrocities allegedly committed by the Crusaders, by the Franks in Jerusalem, which we know are vastly exaggerated. And the précis actually is done in order to lead the viewers to the conclusion that these horrible acts were forms of ethnic cleansing. So following a siege of several days and during which they performed religious rituals in front of the walls of the holy city, the Crusaders stormed into Jerusalem and went on a rampage of slaughter and murder. They started with a massive massacre of people in the streets, homes, and alleyways, Muslims, Jews, and Christians. They were slaughtered because they all had Arab features. The massacre lasted 10 days, and scholars estimate it led to the killing of approximately 100,000 Jerusalemites. The corpses were burned, fingers were cut off, and entrails were sliced open in search of gold and gemstones. The Aqsa Mosque was transformed into a stable for horses. In a similar way, the History Channel documentary opens with the following essentialist hyperbole. And sorry, excuse me.
For thousands of years, the holy lands of the Middle East have run with blood. Here, the scars of battle fought between three of the great religions of the world are etched into the earth. But the deepest wound was made by a war between Christian and Muslim, begun at the close of the 11th century and fought for 200 years. At stake, a tiny strip of land just a few hundred miles long, but with the greatest prize, Jerusalem. Now this holy war has passed into legend. But there were those who saw it with their own eyes. Great chroniclers from two different worlds, Christian and Muslim, who wrote of great deeds, great battles, great warriors, of men who would lay down their lives for their God. This was the collision of two great faiths, the clash between the crescent and the cross. This was the Crusades.
Such provocative language and aggressive description bolstered the understanding that what unfolded at the time was a clash of civilizations. The Muslim East versus the Christian West, Christianity versus Islam. It was a clash fueled by religion, where hate and blind obedience to God trumped, sorry to use foul words here, any other urge. It was bloody and barbaric. What is also implied is that the era of the Crusades was not an anomaly in world history. It was one episode in an ongoing struggle that shaped the past, is shaping the present, and will shape the future. The fact that such documentaries involve a lineup of scholars as advisors or interviewees lends tremendous legitimacy to the content and persuades the viewers that what they are hearing and watching is backed by solid scholarship. It's not true that the Crusades were a clash of civilizations, for neither the Muslims nor the Christians were a unified group. It's not true that religion fueled only hatred and killing, for we have countless examples of religion fueling truces and peaces and friendships between Crusaders and Muslims. It's also not true that contemporary chronicles speak only of great deeds, great battles, great warriors. They speak equally of alliances, friendships, trade, exchange of scientific and other knowledge, forms of coexistence, form of religious tolerance, and the like between Muslim rulers, generals, commanders, and lay people, and their Crusader Frankish counterparts. The problem is in the presentation of the Crusades, in the media in particular, and in some scholarly writings, that focuses almost exclusively on battles and on the religious ideologies that stimulated them and fueled them, ignoring other forms of interactions. Such a focus exploits Crusader history for specific objectives, be they political, ideological, or commercial, and increases polarization in our modern world. Moreover, we are not talking about two camps here, for neither the Christians nor the Muslims were a united group. A few decades, as a context, a few decades before the Crusaders arrived on the scene in 1097, the region witnessed the invasion of the Seljuk Turks, who were Sunnis, specifically Hanafi Sunnis. It's a form of Sunni Islam that flourished throughout Islamic history starting in the 8th century. And beginning in 1071, the invading Seljuk chiefs ended the rule of several Shiite Muslim dynasties in Syria, and ultimately in the 1171 in Egypt as well, but then engaged in many years of infighting over how to divide the newly conquered lands. So we're not talking only about the Crusader invasion, we are also should be factoring in another Muslim invasion to this geography. However, more importantly, Muslim unity against the Crusaders was lacking, and we should keep in mind that actually the overwhelming majority of the people in this geography was not Muslim to start with. To go back in one of the presentations talking about the kind of I think I'm blanking on Eva's presentation. There are lots of Christians that were helping producing these items that the Muslims were consuming and were being sold. So the Christians and Shiites formed the majority of the populations during the Crusader period. And this is not the ideological religious doctrine that people like Saladin subscribe to. So we need to keep that in context when we are talking about actually who were the people mostly impacted. So to go back to that point that Muslim unity against the Crusaders was always lacking throughout this period. As Paul Cobb put it, there was no such thing as the counter-crusade in the sense of a coherent movement against the Franks that shared the same motivations and goals. So when we ignore this complex reality, we essentially endorse and promote the agendas of specific actors, political or religious, historians, propagandists, etc., whose interests and biases made them interpret and see events in specific ways. We also inadvertently fall victim to their exaggeration, falsification, and glorification. Some studies have examined instances of exchange, alliances, and tolerance between Muslims and Crusaders. However, they are treated as isolated cases and rarely recognized as a religiously sanctioned pattern. For instance, in one study on tolerance and peace between Muslims and Crusaders, the author argued that even if the prevailing perception of this period, 1096 to 1291 era, is one of perennial holy war, this epoch of holy war was in fact punctuated by interludes of peace. These treatises were accepted by sides as legally binding, and although in principle a temporary remedy for inability to continue to fight a holy war, in fact, both the Muslim and the Christian political entities could legitimately enjoy periods of peace. Why could tolerance and peace only be opportunistic poses for groups otherwise keen on pursuing their holy wars and killing each other? Why can't we look at the period as one dotted with occasional wars instead of one dotted with occasional peace? That's essentially part of the pattern that I'm trying to analyze here. During the Crusader period, an active diplomacy took place between various Muslim rulers in Syria, Egypt, and northern Mesopotamia, and different Frankish leaders in the Levant, and even in Europe. It addressed many issues that needed to be resolved, such as conflicts, ransoming of captives, commercial and financial grievances, and also features, in some cases, exchange of knowledge and gifts. The religious justification Muslim scholars gave for peace with the Crusaders have not been studied in modern scholarship in any serious manner or systematic manner for that. It is an aspect that requires an extensive inquiry in order to fully understand the religious and legal reasonings, as well as their impact on and ramification on the history of the period. A preliminary examination of a few contemporary Muslim sources gives us some ideas of how truces and treaties concluded between Muslims and Frankish rulers were religiously sanctioned. First, there is the notion of maslaha, what a Muslim leader deems to be in the best interest of the Muslims, be that collectively or in a specific area, and which we find invoked as justification for seeking or accepting peace offers and truces in various treaties of the period. For instance, Saladin's advisor urged him to conclude a truce with King Richard the Lionheart, and they essentially appealed to that notion of it's our best interest to achieve that. So sometimes they use that concept of maslaha. Sometimes they just invoke that it is in our best interest in the sense that we are tired, we can't fight anymore, etc. So they are dancing around that concept. We also come across another concept called darura, and these are extremely important concepts that we find in Islamic legal manuals about justification. These constitute the justification for peace. Darura means necessity, which Islamic law manuals from the period cite as legal basis sanctioning settlement of conflicts. The great Damascene jurist Ibn Qudama, who died in 1223, argued that peace with the enemy is permissible and can be achieved on the basis of a mutual agreement without payment of money or entails money paid by the enemy to the Muslims. As for money paid by the Muslims to the enemy in return for peace, he contended that it is only possible, permissible, if necessity, darura, requires it, such as fear that war might lead to Muslims being killed or taken hostages. For paying money to the enemy is a humiliation which might be tolerated in order to avoid a worse humiliation, such as killing, imprisonment, or enslavement, which leads to unbelief. So hence you have this is legal, religiously legal concept in order to allow Muslims paying. And we know of several cases that Saladin, Nuruddin, and others paying to the Franks in order not to attack them. And these are the kind of religious reasoning behind them. These type of juristic opinions furnished the textual basis for the legal reasoning of the Muslim jurists who were involved in diplomacy and negotiations of truces and treaties. By the way, often what's missing in discussions about truce and peace is actually the direct involvement of many jurists in their negotiation and sometimes actually in their drafting. Aside from the notions of maslaha and the notion of darura, we have verse 861 of the Quran, which often is invoked also as a reason for seeking peace. So, for instance, we have several cases. In 1188, Prince Bohemond of Antioch proposed a peace to Saladin, and his entourage essentially pressured him. Verse 861 says, you should accept peace, you should accept it. Saladin wasn't convinced, but he went along with it. Similarly, during the negotiations with King Richard the Lionheart, Saladin's court advisor pushed him to accept peace, and here is a quote from his secretary, Imad ad-Din Isfahani. It's more advisable, that's what they said to him, that we accept what God had said in the verse which he revealed, namely that if they seek peace, accept it, for only then people could go back to their lands and raise crops. Troops could replenish their supplies and get respite from the vicious conflict. Should war resume, we will be ready and well prepared with food and fodder, not exhausted or penniless. For it is during the days of peace that we get ready for war and prepare the instruments of fighting, etc., etc. Spells of alliances, quasi-peace, and truce between the supposed two camps were stunningly frequent. This was only possible because the terms of these treaties that Franks and Muslims drew called for cessation of hostilities for a fixed period of time, reaching sometimes more than 10 years, and sometimes even renewed. Their impact was evident on the reduction of hostilities and even on curtailing the efforts of several popes to make new calls for the Crusader campaigns. Indeed, the popes were often forced to command the Crusaders, who heeded their calls, to wait until truces with the Muslims have expired before initiating war. In other words, Rome felt obliged to respect the truces, even when the church was against them, which points us to an understanding about the power of medieval diplomacy in setting up certain rules in terms of compliance without necessarily having a force or body to assure compliance. For instance, like today we have the United Nations. The Holy City of Jerusalem, in particular, occupies a central position in the religious universe of Muslims and Christians, and Jews as well. Yet, war over Jerusalem was not always their only recourse. And actually, if we examine during the Crusader period, the First Crusade is actually the anomaly in terms of the encounter. Most often than not, the actual struggle over Jerusalem was settled by peace. For instance, one very well-known case is in 1229, Saladin's nephew, Sultan al-Kamil, concluded a treaty with Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, that saw the two rulers split control over Jerusalem. And this is an account by the Damascene historian Sibt ibn Jawzi, who was completely against it, by the way. So I'm not going to read the details. I'll leave you to read it as I go on for the sake of time. But the most salient, actually, thing that he starts is at the beginning. In this year, the emperor entered Jerusalem when Damascus was under siege. And essentially what he's trying to say is that as Frederick is in Jerusalem, touring it with Muslims, showing him around, Al-Kamil was outside Damascus, besieging it, trying to take it from his own nephew. To underscore that ideally it should be Muslims unifying to fight the Crusaders rather than the other way around. But this is one of the most important instances of actually not, ironically, by the way, that nephew ended up giving Jerusalem to the Crusaders in 1242 as part of a deal. I'm going to save you from... So more importantly, negotiations between Al-Kamil and Frederick were not conducted in secrecy. They were known to all the main actors of the time, and they involved religious scholars and military advisors, such as Al-Kamil's most trusted advisor, Commander Fakhruddin ibn Sheikh, who was knighted by Frederick and who carried the emperor's emblem on his flag until his death in 1250 during a battle against the army of Louis IX. They also feature major jurists such as Shamsuddin al-Urmawi, who died in 1252 and who was the chief judge of the army, and also he was professor of Shafi'i law, Shafi'i Sunni law, at the Saladin College in Cairo. There were also several Ayyubid rulers involved in the negotiations, and their participation tells us that the sovereign, that is Al-Kamil, could not speak on behalf of everybody. He had to assure participation of different Ayyubid emirs and commanders who represent different cities in order to make sure that whatever agreement they could reach, it is possible and also it is implementable. And finally, in my presentation, I'm going to talk about evidence about sharing sacred spaces. In addition to instances when some Muslims and Franks opted to work out peaceful solutions instead of going to war over Jerusalem, we also have evidence about sharing religious sites sacred to Muslims and Franks. We find, for instance, a very interesting debate that happened when Saladin took back Jerusalem or captured Jerusalem in 1187, that they debated what should happen to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And what essentially settled the decision not to touch it or destroy it or even confiscate it was a precedent that Caliph Umar established when he conquered Jerusalem. He confirmed the right to the place, that is the Christians' right to the place, and did not order the structure to be demolished. So that it becomes we can call the legal precedent that later on Muslim rulers kept raising as a pretext for why they cannot touch this place. The only exception is this Fatimid ruler, Hakim bi Amrillah, who destroyed it. But we know Hakim bi Amrillah has his own issues in the sense that he thought himself God, and therefore he could do anything. And also, we don't have evidence that actually the Franks destroyed Muslim religious space, although in most cases they confiscated them. In the case of the Dome of the Rock, which they call Templum Domini, we have evidence from Al-Harawi, a Muslim cleric who visited Jerusalem for several weeks in 1173. And he went into the Dome of the Rock, he went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he went to other cities as well. And in this statement, he says, I entered Jerusalem, etc. And no, that's actually, sorry, this is not the proper illustration. Anyway, he tells us, and here I'm quoting, all of the inscriptions and the reliefs are made of gold. He's talking about the inscription reliefs in the Dome of the Rock. The Franks did not alter any of the verses of the noble Quran or the names of the caliphs that are above the gates. So this statement, the Franks did not alter any, is repeated throughout his description of his visits to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, many of the parts there, and actually stand to as evidence for us that actually this material was present when the Crusaders were using this space as a Christian religious space. So what kind of memory, lasting memory, it left for all these Christian pilgrims? Possibly none of them thought that this is Islamic, right? I'm not necessarily saying that they are encountering Islam consciously here, but this is there for them to consume and bring back to Europe. And also Al-Harawi reported about actually his visit to Hebron, where he came into contact, actually he met him in Bethlehem, this Frankish knight called Byron, who told him that he was a boy and he took part in the renovation of the sanctuary where the patriarchs are buried in Hebron. And there you see how the worlds of these two, Frank and the Muslim, through a religious common heritage, they are able to communicate. And Al-Harawi ends his account by saying, if that is true, what Byron is telling me, then I have seen someone who had seen Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob while awake, that he saw them in his own eyes, not like I have heard by many Muslims dreaming about these people. And there you have evidence of actually religion being a common thread that the two groups shared. Finally, there is no doubt that the Crusader period witnessed heightened military tension between certain Europeans and Muslim actors. At the same time, it also witnessed extensive non-military interactions and peaceful relations. The complexity of the period's history and the ranges of interactions between Muslims and Crusaders compel us to move beyond the hegemony of the one-dimensional approach to read the period as a clash of civilizations. Such a nuanced approach de-weaponizes the Crusades and helps us understand the period on its own terms, thus undermining the political, religious, or civilizational agenda that for a long time have dominated the presentation of the Crusades. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll move on to our next speaker, who is Dr. Matthew Gabriele. He's professor of medieval studies and chair of the Department of Religion and Culture, at Virginia Tech. His research and teaching focuses on religion, violence, nostalgia, and apocalypse in various combinations, whether manifested in the European Middle Ages or modern world. His public writing has appeared in such places as the Washington Post, Time Magazine, Smithsonian Magazine, Forbes Magazine, and the Daily Beast. His latest book, congrats, co-authored with David M. Perry, is entitled The Bright Ages, A New History of Medieval Europe. That's Harper Books, 2021, and he's currently working on a new book, also with David M. Perry, entitled Oathbreakers, The Carolingian Civil War and the Collapse of an Empire in the European Middle Ages, also Harper Books, forthcoming 2024. And his presentation today is entitled A Clash of Academic Civilizations, The Politics of Studying the Crusades After 9/11.
Thank you so much. I'll just add to the chorus of well-deserved thanks to Amanda and to the College of Holy Cross for putting this on. It's been a real pleasure. I was joking with people earlier, and I'll make that joke because I really only have like one or two jokes that I tell, that I do have some trepidation about being in the last session because I don't want to stand between us and the drinks and the reception at the end, so I'll move through quickly. So my brief talk today will be maybe a bit different from my colleagues from the rest of the symposium, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the actual European Middle Ages themselves. Instead, I'd like today to ask us to think about how we talk about the so-called Crusades today, about the long tale of Christian holy war generally, and perhaps some unseen historiography of those Crusades, particularly in the 21st centuries. Historians are, in some ways, called upon to be either ghostbusters or exorcists. What they are, in some part, has to do with what people are saying on Twitter, I guess. But what I mean is that we as scholars are, I think, increasingly, and for the better, attentive to things formerly largely unseen. We see now better how the assumptions and pieties of our scholarly forebears flit like ghosts around the edges of our vision, rearranging the furniture so we sometimes stub our toes. But now we're summoning them into view, understanding better how to break free from their spell to encounter the medieval past afresh. We reveal these ghosts by shining a light on the past to reveal all its hidden secrets, all its messiness and complications, and all the potentials that lay unfulfilled, roads that weren't taken. As such, my talk today takes aim at the so-called clash of civilizations framework, which has, especially since 9/11, shaped how we view this historical encounter between Christianity and Islam. At its core, the clash thesis suggests an internal struggle between Islam and the West, as Suleiman just discussed. This is a framework to which some consciously and others unconsciously sometimes still adhere. Indeed, sometimes I get emails that bring this directly into focus. Anyway, today I hope to show that Huntington's ghost has pulled scholarship on medieval holy war into discourses of contemporary politics, in particularly unproductive ways. But the proper response is not to retreat towards some naive goal of being better, dispassionate observers, and more on why in just a minute, but rather to acknowledge that the study of the so-called Crusades has itself created its fair share of historiographical ghosts, and then work to reveal and exorcise them by working against the bad faith actors who sustain them. So let me start with the clash of civilizations. The phrase itself dates more or less to the early 1990s, coined by the historian Bernard Lewis, but then elaborated and developed by the political scientist Samuel Huntington in a 1993 article and then in his 1996 book. Briefly, the argument suggests that ideologies, which was how he argued that the world was organized in modernity, broke down after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so the world was reshuffling. Now and in the future, Huntington argued, the world would be divided by cultures, with civilizations being the highest form of those cultures. For him, religion was embedded within and distinctive to those cultures. For our purposes today, the important part to note is that, according to Huntington, in the future, the hegemonic power of the so-called West, Christianity, would be challenged by the Sinic, the Chinese or Confucian, and the Islamic, mostly meaning the Middle East and North Africa, with the supposed Islamic threat, says threat, being the most serious. To make the case that the threat from Islam was the most grave, Huntington looks to the past and draws a direct line from the initial Arab expansion in the 7th and 8th centuries to the end of the 20th century, which, he argues, sees the Islamic world angry at the West because of the freedoms posited by Western Enlightenment values. Certainly, Huntington's thesis did have, and continues to have, of course, its critics in the public sphere. Edward Said famously rebutted the argument in late 2001 in an article notably, but certainly unintentionally, appearing almost immediately after 9/11. But even as late as 2015, Robert Wright in The New Yorker wrote about how narratives of civilizational conflict like Huntington's actually self-perpetuate by creating the conditions under which extremism thrives, simplifying the world into us versus them, and thereby reinforcing the extremists' worldview. Nevertheless, Huntington's thesis became orthodoxy, especially in the American foreign policy establishment during the late 1990s and early 2000s, particularly after 9/11. This was most noticeable in the George W. Bush administration, which, confusingly, both projected and tamped down the idea of this civilizational conflict. Although the president did try to emphasize that the invasion of Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, and revenge against al-Qaeda didn't mean the West was at war with, quote-unquote, Islam, these sporadic public pronouncements sat uneasily with the administration's continued use of Huntingtonian language, referencing a global war on terror with an explicit focus on Islamic extremism, as well as the easy conflation his administration made between al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In addition, we must remember that the Bush administration repeatedly claimed that bin Laden orchestrated an attack because he, quote-unquote, hated our freedoms, that his administration repeatedly used the term crusade, and that the Department of Defense, which you see a slide from a leaked DoD presentation, made explicit use of biblical imagery in prosecuting America's wars from Donald Rumsfeld there. Okay. And it continues. In 2013, the magazine Foreign Affairs ran a special issue concluding that Huntington was more right than wrong. Then, shortly after the terrorist attacks in June 2017 at London Bridge in England, a Republican congressman from Louisiana by the name of Clay Higgins posted on Facebook, you can see that here, saying that, quote, "The free world, all of Christendom, is at war with Islamic horror. Not one penny of American treasure should be granted to any nation that harbors these heathen animals. Every conceivable measure should be engaged to hunt them down, hunt them, identify them, and kill them all. For the sake of all that is good and righteous, kill them all." These sentiments evoking the Crusades as a model for how to kill Muslims were echoed by white supremacist writers at venues such as Breitbart, the Daily Wire, and Town Hall. And indeed, the clash thesis was strongly revived under former President Trump, pushed by many of his advisors such as Mike Flynn, Steve Bannon, Mike Pompeo. And as if trying to prove my point, in March 2022, just this last year, Ross Douthat of the New York Times published a piece entitled, "Yes, There Is a Clash of Civilizations," and Sheldon Whitehouse, Democratic senator from Rhode Island, said just in January of this year, and in reference to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that, quote, "In general, Samuel Huntington was right. We are involved in a clash of civilizations." I offer this brief scan through recent American foreign policy because it begins to reveal, I think, how Huntington's framework is used as a kind of proxy argument about other things. Their thesis is a hammer, so all they're seeing are nails. What I mean is that supporters of the clash thesis tend to be right-leaning presentists trying to make sense of the world they see around them by cherry-picking in time backwards and forwards. Here's a bit, for example, and to explain what I mean, of what Huntington says. He writes, you see it on the board there, "Conflict along the fault lines between Western and Islamic civilizations has been going on for 1,300 years. After the founding of Islam, the Arab and Moorish surge west and north only ended at Tours in 732. From the 11th to the 13th centuries, the Crusaders attempted with temporary success to bring Christianity and Christian rule to the Holy Land. From the 14th to the 17th century, the Ottoman Turks reversed the balance, extended their sway over the Middle East and the Balkans, captured Constantinople, and twice laid siege to Vienna. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Ottoman power declined, Britain, France, and Italy established Western control over most of North Africa and the Middle East." Now, this schematic overview says a lot, but it erases even more. It flattens the past into individual moments that transcend hundreds of years to connect then and now. Huntington makes us jump nearly, in this brief paragraph, nearly 400 years from 732, the Battle of Tours, to 1100, the Crusades, then 350 more years from 1100 to 1453, the Ottoman capture of Constantinople, then 200 years from 1453 to 1683, the Second Siege of Vienna, and finally 250 more years from 1683 to around 1900, the retreat of the Ottomans and expansion of the British and French colonial adventures. Now, I'm just a simple country historian. But is it really fair to link all of these events together under the umbrella of a trans-historical civilization of Islam? No, of course not. A lot can happen over a few centuries. But the erasure of this change over time is the point, because what Huntington and his political and scholarly adherents are doing actually isn't history at all, it's nostalgia. And this is what nostalgia does. It simplifies, tries to draw lines directly from the now to the then, creating what I've called before in other writing, a rainbow connection. One of nostalgia's most serious theorists, the late Svetlana Boym, has noted that nostalgia is always ostensibly about the past, but always more seriously about the present and the future. What it does is attempts to draw a line directly from today to some moment in the past, but to jump over, ignore events and ideas that complicate the future, that actually tell the story of how you get from then there to here. It's a way of sanitizing the past in order to make a specific contemporary political or cultural point, to leave out the contingency and debate within history. But nostalgia, like a rainbow, is a trick of the light. It dissipates into the air when you get close, when you consult the primary sources of the past, when you account for the messiness of humanity. Unfortunately, medievalists have often fallen for the illusion. Kristen Skotke has explained that sometimes historians introduce the, quote, this is quoting her, concept of the clash of civilizations to medieval studies as a way to understand the historical roots of present Islamic atrocities. Just to take one brief example, Thomas Madden ended his popular teaching textbook, The New Concise History of the Crusades, published in 2005, more than 14,000 physical copies sold, with a statement that medieval Christian holy war was fundamentally defensive in nature. They were, he writes, quote, desperate expeditions to defend against ever-expanding Muslim empires, end quote. And this matters, again, because, again, quoting, quote, the attacks in the United States on September 11th, 2001, which were viewed by Islamists and some others in the Middle East as an act of jihad against a crusading state, end quote. This does a certain type of rhetorical work, putting these statements together, giving the illusion of history, but actually framing the events of the past transhistorically. This, too, is a type of rainbow connection, pulling the medieval and the modern together to stand next to one another, implying causation. But of course, Madden isn't alone in seeing as defensive the eruption of Christian holy war beginning in the 11th century. This remains a common trope, repeated by both scholars and in the popular media. The most popular scholarly and academic English language books, at least according to Nielsen Bookscan, by Dan Jones and Tom Asbridge, for example, soften but still structure their works in the same way. Christian land was taken, Byzantium was under threat, then the Crusades ended, but were re-entered into popular consciousness by the European colonial powers and taken up by Arab nationalists and later far-right Islamic terrorists. The second one up there, the Ibrahim and Hansen book, purportedly sets out to quote, set the much distorted historical record between the West and Islam straight, and in so doing, demonstrate once and for all that Muslim hostility for the West is not an aberration, but a continuation of Islamic history, end quote. The book starts with the Battle of Yarmouk in the 7th century, continues through the siege of Vienna in the 17th, and ends in the modern United States with an invocation and endorsement of the early 20th century anti-Semite Hilaire Belloc and the threat Islam poses to quote-unquote white civilization. Yes, you heard that right. Islam is a threat to white civilization. The book ends with an explicit call for the West to embrace its heritage, Christianity, and unsheath its sword to fight back against Islam. His words. Huntington's ghost still haunts these halls, deployed here as a weapon of war. But before we dismiss this book as little more than a far-right screed, which it kind of is, we should note the book's sales rank as well as its endorsements. It has sold thousands and thousands of copies. And its endorsements, alongside a rogues gallery of far-right pundits, we see academics. Crusades historian Paul Crawford, Middle Eastern historian James Lindsay, historian of medieval Iberia Dario Fernandez Morea, and Crusades historian Tom Madden. Ibrahim was even a featured speaker, I should say, at the U.S. Army War College in 2020 to explain Islam to future officers. In this brief survey of best-selling books is leaving for now what Western Civ textbooks or God help us YouTube do. The video here by anti-vaxxer and racist Steven Crowder, for example, is the most watched historical video about the Crusades. And it's, as you may guess, simply a tirade against the barbarism of Islam writ large. In all these cases, we begin somewhere in the Middle Ages and end with 9/11 and global Islamic terror, even if sometimes those starting ending points are left unspoken. I don't have time today to lay out all the evidence here, but there has indeed, of course, been much scholarship showing the true origins of the claim that medieval Christian holy war was defensive. Much of this has to do with a long-term misunderstanding of how our sources were constructed and what they're trying to do. In part, this comes from Augustine, as, let's be honest, most troubling things do. But because we have to remember that many of our primarily monastic authors cowered in Augustine's shadow, intellectually captured by his conception of a just war, in which the delimited acceptable causes for war were only defensive. This must be coupled with the fact that European medieval authors never claimed to be impartial observers. Their stories about the past, even the recent one, were about moral lessons, were about finding theological meaning in the world, were about tailoring their recounting of events to fit biblical models. The Crusaders moving as the new Moses into the promised land, their victories as like those of Joshua in one case, like the Maccabees against the Greeks in another, etc. One of the most popular histories of the late 11th century, First Crusade, for example, went so far as to ask his readers, quoting Robert the Monk, "Since the creation of the world, what more miraculous undertaking has there been, other than the mystery of the redeeming cross, than what was achieved in our own time by the journey of our people to Jerusalem?" The success of the First Crusade, Robert the Monk was arguing, was on the same level of significance in sacred history as the crucifixion of Jesus. This is kind of a bold claim to make. But it's also a revealing one. Because in all cases, and in this one maybe the most extreme to our modern ears, things are unjustly done to the protagonists, which in turn force the people of God in these rhetorical structures to react. The Israelites were attacked and fought back. Jesus was unjustly persecuted, but triumphed. The Crusaders were being pressed by the enemies of Christ and responded. This is the Christian medieval's own version of a clash of civilizations, a Manichaean us versus them battle between God and his enemies that played out on earth with swords and spears. But it was, is, and always will be a rhetorical pose, and one we, as scholars, don't have to repeat. In Louise Erdrich's 2021 novel, The Sentence, a bookstore is haunted by its most annoying customer. Many attempts are made, but the ghost is only finally exorcised when it's directly confronted, when it's told a hard, and in this case a painful truth about a debt that the living owe to the dead. The study of medieval Christian holy war must begin to confront its ghosts with hard truths, to acknowledge how we were naive about medieval sources, to think more critically about the unspoken questions of previous scholars and how they limit our own explorations, and to think about how we have been and continue to be and will continue to be shaped by the world in which we live. In this case, the ghost of Huntington lies cloaked, not beneath a sheet, but beneath nostalgia, tipping over furniture so as to steer us through the past on a preset path towards a teleological end. But the reality is that the past was filled with people, messy, complicated people who made decisions that altered the outcome of events and who could have also chosen otherwise. This we must embrace. Every paradox, every why and how puzzle we see in the past that opens up to us possible worlds, that shows that just as much as the past could have been different, our own future can be different as well. The clash thesis rests upon an ontologically aggressive Islam paired with an ontologically defensive Christianity, and it steals from us both the past and the future. It takes away our agency in the present because it was always so. It erases our culpability, our responsibility to each other in the present because it always has been so. The challenge of academic rigor is to deal ethically with both our audience and our subjects. As Michel Rolfe-Trouillot reminded us some time ago, quote, historical representations cannot be conceived only as vehicles for the transmission of knowledge. They must establish some relation to that knowledge. Authenticity is required, and authenticity obtains only in regard to current practices that engage us as witnesses, actors, and commentators, end quote. Or to put it another way, objectivity is not neutrality. Neutrality replicates claims regardless of their truth value. Objectivity asks us to make thoughtful decisions about truth value, to ask questions of our assumptions, to consider ethics. It's neutral to list events that happened in the past, even if separated by hundreds of years and vast geographies. But it's objectively all right to say, for instance, just to pull an idea out of my head, that the Crusades are one aspect of a larger phenomenon related to Christian holy war and need to be contextualized as such. Each expedition to Jerusalem, to Iberia, to the Baltics, to the south of France happened for very specific reasons that involve our modern categories of religion, politics, culture, economics, etc. It is objectively all right to say that things change over time, and that there simply are no lines that directly connect events separated by 1,000 or more years, a Crusades phenomenon. It's objectively all right to say that if we claim the medieval holy war was quote-unquote defensive, then we're making a theological and a political claim that privileges Christianity, the West, as an ontological good. And it's objectively all right to say that anyone suggesting a simple explanation for a historical phenomenon is selling something. In Erdrich's The Sentence, the malevolent ghost is finally exorcised by, well, a sentence spoken by the protagonist. The sentence is an ethical reckoning, a thank you through gritted teeth, and a goodbye. The ghost haunting the bookstore finally leaves, slamming the door on its way out, allowing those haunted to fully own their lives going forward. Let us, then, we who study religious violence, first reveal and then exorcise all our historiographical ghosts by acknowledging our troubling debts and then closing the door so we can ask new, different, hopefully better questions about the past. Thank you.
Okay, so we are coming to the end with our last but not least speaker, who is Dr. Paul M. Cobb. He is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Term Professor of Islamic History in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a social and cultural historian and the pre-modern Islamic world. His areas of interest include historiography, Islamic relations with the West, animal studies, and travel and exploration. He is, in particular, a recognized authority on the history of the medieval crusade in their Islamic context. He's author of numerous books and articles, including White Banners, Contention in Abbasid Syria, 750 to 880, SUNY Press, 2001, Usama ibn Munqidh, Warrior Poet of the Age of Crusades, One World, 2005, The Book of Contemplation, Islam and the Crusades, a translation of the memoirs and other works of Usama ibn Munqidh from Penguin Classics in 2008, and most recently, The Race for Paradise, An Islamic History of the Crusades, Oxford University Press, 2014. He is also the co-editor of Strategies of Medieval Communal Identity, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Also with co-author Umayyad Legacies, History and Memory from Syria to Spain. And at the moment, he is hard at work on an edition and translation of The Hunter's Companion, a 14th century Arabic manual of animal lore and hunting advice by the Mamluk writer Ibn Mangli. So he is going to offer some concluding remarks, and once he's finished, we'll bring our speakers together for Q&A. Thank you.
The Brabantine preacher and encyclopedist Thomas of Cantimpré, writing in the 1220s or so, a rough contemporary then of the tiles that have so dominated our thoughts today, confidently begins his entry on lions with the statement that the lion is the king of beasts, citing as his sources Pliny, as expected, along with a certain Jacobus. Thomas's Muslim contemporaries could hardly disagree. Usama ibn Munqidh, writing in the 1180s, was a famous terrorizer of lions and noted that lions shared with eagles the quality of instilling an instinctive awe in all other animals. The Mamluk huntsman Ibn Mangli, writing in the 1370s, urges his sultan to fear lions too. If you're being menaced by a lion, whether you are mounted or on foot, and there is no other choice, provided you're confident that you and your mount know what you're doing, then invoke God's name and go after it. If not, then under no circumstances should you expose yourself to the risk. You are strictly forbidden to do so. The relevance of these little anecdotes to our day-long conversation will be clear when we consider that Ibn Mengli was better known as an author of a treatise on military strategy, that Usama made great use of hunting imagery when discussing his battles with his most bestial foes, the Franks, and that Jacobus, whom Thomas of Cantimpré cites, was none other than Jacques de Vitry, Bishop of Acre, veteran of the Fifth Crusade and author of the Historia Orientalis. You could hardly ask for clearer evidence, save for the example of the Chertsey tiles themselves, that medieval kingship, hunting, and crusade are inextricably entangled. And entangling and disentangling have been at the heart of today's nourishing and thought-provoking conference. The entanglement of the tiles themselves with other medieval objects and decorative schemes, of Chertsey Abbey with other institutions across and beyond Christendom, and of England, the putative home of the title of our symposium, with the wider world of medieval Afro-Eurasia. For this very exciting day, I'd like to thank Amanda and the other conference organizers and staff, Tom Landy, Meredith Fluke, Ruby Francis, workers in food services, the drivers of the vans who got us here on time, and all our generous hosts here at the College of the Holy Cross, the McFarland Center, the Cantor Gallery, and the great city of Worcester, Mass. It is wicked cool to be back here. But I'd especially like to thank our participants, speakers, moderators, and audience members for providing the discussions over the more than a dozen papers we heard today. It is my honor and challenge here at the end of the day, as I see it, to pull at some common threads from all these entanglements and to position, by way of conclusion, the papers we heard today as platforms for further discussion about broader themes invoked by our panels and their constituent papers. To do so, I will take inspiration from the medieval authors that I began with and organize my comments around the two themes of animals and of crusading, adding a third, namely fantasy, as something nearly ubiquitous here and therefore not to be underestimated when considering how a Holy Land might ever be brought home. Will we ever tire of looking at these tiles, by the way? There were, of course, no actual lions in England or Chertsey. Save for the occasional royal gift or fanciful representation, as in the tiles, going on crusade, as Nick Paul has mentioned, was practically one of the few viable contexts in which one might ever encounter a lion. But let us not forget that Chertsey's lions occupied a crowded Surrey biosphere, from dormice to eels below to falcons and egrets above, to say nothing of the domesticated animals that inhabited the Abbey's impressive landholdings, fish pond, and other possessions, as detailed by Ewan Roger in his paper, providing, no doubt, the cellarer's cheese that he mentioned and other sustenance for Chertsey's community. And these too jostled alongside all other kinds of creatures in between, real and imaginary, wise and wonderful, great and small. Roger mentions almost in passing the doodles of the early 15th century monk mannery, suggesting that, quote, they are nowhere near the standard of the images depicted on the Chertsey tiles. Maybe. Mannery's idle drawings of fish and rabbits are one thing, but his monkey, another non-native species, is evidence enough, if one needed it, that medieval Chertsey, even in the scriptorium, was connected to a wider world. And animals, as organisms in their own right, as commodities and as companions, mark these connections for us because they are among the most distinctive and most mobile of historical actors. But animals were not just organisms or commodities. They were also symbols. And it is their great mobility as bearers of meaning that we see most powerfully at Chertsey, as Betsy Dospel-Williams and Sarah Guérin have amply shown us in their papers on textiles and ivories, respectively. The tiles, roundels, and combat and hunting motifs suggest a clear connection to textiles from Byzantium, Egypt, Central Asia, and back again. And they evoke the animal portrait roundels that seem to be an expected feature of the olifants carved by Sicilian and Andalusian artists out of elephant ivory, traded from West Africa and gifted between medieval European elites. Teeming with carved lions and ibex and fitted with gilt silver thickets inhabited by camels and other beasts, olifants touted to Western European viewers symbolic animals that, while zoologically foreign, were semiotically familiar. The association of ivory with Marian purity and the Solomonic throne only added to the mystique of this substance. As Guérin puts it, Ivory was multivalent in medieval England, hard to pin down, but it is clear that it signaled an interconnected world with broad horizons stretching far beyond the British Isles. Put less subtly, that is in my words, I would say that in these textiles and ivory objects, we have here another example of the way in which the semiotic overlap in crusading, kingship, and hunting effectively mandated the entanglement of medieval England with the broader world of medieval Afro-Eurasia. And of course, on those Oliphants are some old hometown friends, the hounds, hinds, and hares joining the exotics in what Nick Paul calls the global aristocratic practice of the hunt. Immediately legible by its ornament and indeed its form and function, the Oliphants connected their various owners to hunters and aspirational nature lords across the Mediterranean in much the same way that the Chertsey lion hunting tiles conjured up ancient myth, Eastern hagiography, continental romance, and tales of Crusader valor in Outremer. Hunting was also wonderfully easy to allied with its more popular analog, warfare. In the most famous of the Chertsey tiles, we see how easily the animal allides into the human. Set alongside roundels of hunters impaling lions with their spears, Richard the Lionheart tilts at Saladin himself, his lance skewering the Sultan, the king thereby bagging this most noble of game. And I would add that the slide that you see there also suggests something about elision. One would never go hunting wearing chainmail. And what's more, for Muslim hunters contemporary with these images, real men who actually hunted real lions, these images and their implications would have been just as legible, as the hunt, its practices and its symbols, was one of the many areas of common ground shared with the Franks. The Syrian aristocrat Osama ibn Munqidh, cited earlier, might have found the elision of hunted lions with Saladin distasteful, but he could hardly dispute the power of the analogy between holy war and the hunt. Which brings us to crusading. The series of church-sanctioned armed pilgrimages to the Holy Land since the 11th century, the establishment of Latin principalities there, and the expansion of the concept into other theaters of conflict in the decades before the creation of the Chertsey tiles, clearly inspired their creators. As Amanda Leister puts it in her introductory overview, the theme of the entire floor is that of crusading, and so focusing on the tiles, quote, enables us to see the visual world of medieval England in a different way. The Chertsey tiles show graphic violence against non-Christians and also a reliance on events and objects from the Eastern Mediterranean to characterize English desires, history, and destiny. Leister argues persuasively, my brother is right now calling me in the middle of my lecture. That is a classic move on his part. Leister argues persuasively that the immediate crusading context for the tiles was the defeat of the French King Louis IX at Damietta in 1250, and the desire of King Henry III and his wife Eleanor of Provence to produce a new Crusader hero in Henry, the nephew, after all, of the Lionheart himself. But one could easily imagine these tiles, or something like them, without Henry and Eleanor's input. For crusading, by the middle of the 13th century, was also an ambient vibe among Latin elites, part of the warp and weft of medieval Latin society that left few areas entirely untouched. Matthew Reeve, in what I, as an outsider, can only call a revelatory piece of reconstruction and detective work, has now demonstrated to us the extent to which the imperatives of crusading ideology shaped art and architecture, and not just interiors, across medieval England, overturning earlier models of English exceptionalism on this question. Moreover, Nick Paul has shown us just how committed the relatively new class of European chivalric nobility were to display their status in a network of crusading-linked aristocratic spaces across the Mediterranean, in chapter houses like that of Chertsey and palaces like that of John of Ibelin, among many others. Here, in spaces of hospitality and socialization, European nobles could ritually perform their connection to history, romance, and new courtly ideologies. The Franks, as Paroma Chatterjee reminds us, were no fools when it came to the politically charged display of splendor and spectacle. And splendor is what the Franks had come to expect by the time Chertsey's tiles were laid down, as Eva Hoffman has shown in her paper. Hoffman charts the ever-increasing demand for the luxury goods of the Eastern Mediterranean, metalwork, textiles, olifants, and elaborately painted ceramics, to name just a few. These are not just idle souvenirs, but rather mass-produced and portable objects that fairly screamed their broader horizons and projected, and I'm quoting here, an elevated aesthetic, suggestive of luxury for this new class of chivalric nobility. They would, moreover, have a lasting impact on European tastes for years to come. Cynthia Hahn, in her paper, details perhaps the most valuable of all such objects making their way to new homes in England for a variety of purposes, relics. Naomi Speakman's paper, dealing with a Swiss reliquary only accidentally housed now in England, reminds us too that relics themselves often came literally bound up in their own material context. For all the flash that St. Eustace's head conveys to visitors to the BM, it is the humble and rarely seen textiles wrapping the relics that tell the real story of Latin Christendom's far-flung connections. Hahn's discussion of only a few such relics, the ones coveted by the English faithful, suggests something of the bustling traffic involved, and together, these two papers make clear that the entanglements of England with the Eastern Mediterranean were relentlessly driven by the desire of Western Christians to somehow appropriate the holiness of the East, to bring the Holy Land home. Which brings us to fantasy, because all of this is fantasy. Richard never met Saladin, still less did he run him through. Henry and Eleanor never did go on crusade despite their vows, though not for want of trying. And England's broader horizons did not prevent Henry's long reign from becoming a high point in the history of anti-Jewish sentiment in England. Bringing the Holy Land back home is not all lion hearts and coronets, but also, as Matthew Gabriele reminds us, it can also evoke tiki torches, swastikas, and cries of Deus Vult, the hidden cost of dwelling too lovingly on the polarized discourse of holy war. That, too, is another kind of fantasy. As is, for that matter, as Lloyd de Beers shows us, ideas about Gothic revival of national antiquities underpinning the growth of medieval collections at the British Museum and elsewhere. Of course, aiding and abetting all this wishful thinking is the fact that fantasy underpinned the whole crusading enterprise from the beginning in spectacular ways, as Richard Layson shows in his analysis of representations of the Pas Saladin. Fantastically, no pun intended, wonderfully. Here we have the very sort of romance that energized the artists who created the Trizzi tiles, a romance that specifically places Richard and Saladin in combat, and whose distinctive iconography, Layson argues, made possible another kind of elision, transposing a combat set in Palestine to another blessed plot, this England. In the Pas Saladin, at least, fantasy allowed medieval people to bringing the Holy Land home to its logical conclusion. With the ingathering of relics, luxury objects, recreations of the Holy Sepulchre, and other bearers of Eastern Mediterranean culture that accompanied this elision, a medieval English devotee could safely experience the Holy Land at home, without all the bother involved in confronting rival claims or different cultures. Because fantasy was not merely escapist reaction, but also a powerful vehicle for conveying values and lessons. Medievals had their lessons about the Crusades, just as we now have ours, which one hopes would be different. Gabriele, for example, traces the genealogy of Huntington's omnipresent class of civilizations thesis backward and its powerful spectral staying power forward into our own present, his narrative punctuated by memorable Ted Lassovian adages. He asks us to acknowledge Huntington's and similar ghosts in the study of the Crusades and the medieval past, that we might begin again to produce an objective, ethical understanding. He wants us, like parents of teenagers, to embrace the messiness, by which he means, I think, the contingent, the entangled, and the human. And it is the messiness that Suleiman Mourad, too, sees as essential to combating the class of civilizations model and its variants that so dominates popular narratives of the Crusades. A messiness that complicates any simple story dominated merely by trumpets and drums, and that makes space for the enduring, if less lurid, realities of peaceful exchange and grudging coexistence that marked this encounter, even if they were punctuated by episodes of conflict ready-made for the tilemaker's fantastical art. All the papers we've heard today are steps out of such fantasy-based frameworks. Taken together in all their diversity and differences of method, subject, and style, the papers of the symposium have decisively demonstrated that even at Chertsey Abbey, situated on an island that is itself on an island, the community of the faithful and its many visitors was, like it or not, deeply entwined with their kin and their rivals on an increasingly global stage. These considerations around the themes of animals, crusading, and fantasy then allow me, by way of conclusion, to offer three sort of meta questions to kick off a question and answer period that might be specific to our speakers or general to the experience of the symposium today. They are drawn from all of our really wonderful papers. You can probably figure out which ones as I dilate here. First, networks. This was a day replete with Franks, Tristrams, and Sherlocks. This should cause us to reflect on networks, human networks, in a room full of professors and students, but also the medieval networks of kinship, friendship, and dependency on all shores of the Mediterranean that generated the bases of knowledge about the past that medievals had and that we have. Second, fragments. How does the prominence of fragments in what we do, Grombrigian piles of tiles, narratives, manuscripts, relics, wrappings, tusks, and bones as parts representatives of the whole, as tesserae to be assembled and reassembled, shape what we know and what we don't yet. Third, and finally, institutions. One could ask the same question about the institutional frameworks. I say this not just to address the elephant in the room, that is, that our conference enjoys the hospitality of the College of the Holy Cross, home of the Crusaders, no less, or the drive to build national collections, but also to acknowledge how the priorities and imperatives of medieval institutions, for example, royal households or the Catholic Church, frame our knowledge of the past. I hope these general considerations will produce questions, fruitful, ethical, and generative questions in the spirit of this remarkable and generous symposium. Thank you.
Should we have folks come up, or do maybe our speakers come and join us? Is it possible to get a little lighting, or maybe? Oh, thank you, Amanda. Okay, folks, so we're gonna take questions, comments, and we'll do as in the other panels. If you have a question, please, if you could go to the mic. That way everyone can hear, and it gets into the recording as well.
So that was awesome. Notwithstanding Paul's amazing ability to wrap everything up under time pressure, I'm kind of in awe of that last presentation. But I wanted to ask Suleiman, I was struck, so Clash of Civilizations, I was struck when you were talking about the Al Jazeera piece, the I forget what it was called, but he talked about giving the story of the Crusade from an Arab perspective, not a Muslim perspective. I've taught this, the sort of way in which the Crusades are understood within an Arab nationalist context, and then a sort of Muslim, sort of a Said Qutb type of perspective, and where the historicization of that is. But if we sort of think about those as different categories, and actually come to think of it, this picks up on something we were talking about briefly last night. We pick up on that in terms of the different, I mean, again, I don't want to make black and whites because our whole day has been about let's not be black and white, but the sources that you talk about and are thinking about Muslim jurists, not Arab jurists, right? And of course, on the ground in the Middle East, were all sorts of Christians and all sorts of all sorts of Muslims. I don't know how to characterize them. Are they ethnically different? Are they tribally different? And so I wonder, I just want to hear you talk about what happens if you take the kind of Muslim-Christian renegotiation and think about it not in terms of religions, but in terms of other types of groups, of tribes, of armies, of peoples. Or, again, I don't know whether the correct term here is ethnicities or, I don't know, but there's Turks, there's Kurds, right? So what happens then if we reframe it, the question of alliances and divisions? Because, of course, we all know that for all our interest in reframing this long, difficult history that isn't one of inimical, people do group with themselves, people are tribal. And history is often born by the understandings of how we understand those tribes. So I guess that's way too long of asking, what happens if we think about it not as Christian-Muslim, but as like Franks versus local Christians versus Arabs versus Kurds versus Turks? Does that make sense? Okay.
So essentially, you are trying to further complicate the situation. No, I completely understand, and I think that your comment here, I don't take it as a question as much as a comment in a sense. It exposes the fact that the more we reduce it to specific categories, the more we are oblivious of the nuances that were important factors in the reality of the time. So we're trying to imagine uniformed groups, but one thing you cannot say about the period is it was never uniform. So not only you have different ethnicities, but I want to add another layer to that invariably we comment and we study and we judge on the basis of a specific literati elite. And therefore, the view from the grounds up, that is of the lay people, is invariably absent. So if you want to try to add that to the equation, that would further complicate the usage of these things. So often my problem, I think someone earlier today mentioned, in my work I find, for instance, the word Islam or Muslim as a very problematic category of analysis. When you say it, what does it tell me? What should I assume? It's fine, for instance, if I say Sunni, that will narrow it down, right? Male Sunni, that will further narrow it down. But when you are living in a geography that was extremely contested by different groups, that featured huge groups that actually, if you put them in the same room, they don't share anything. Sometimes even they can't speak to each other. And I'm talking sometimes about Muslims here, right? So yeah, talking about Muslims and Franks and Crusaders is a problematic designation, except that sometimes you have to have a starting point for this conversation. And it's fine, provided we clarify the pitfalls. So I'm not sure if in this way
I guess I was just thinking the Al Jazeera framing it as Arab versus Muslim is a different clash. It's a clash of something different.
Yeah, because this is where the ideology, this is how the Al Jazeera wants to frame this, right, as an Arab, because there are two agendas in Al Jazeera, and they don't agree with each other. There is an Islamication agenda and this Arabization agenda. So that is obviously a product of what you could call the Arabization agenda that tries to appeal to some kind of fantasy of Arab nationalism. It's a very complicated story. And even though it's called the shock, what shocked me in that is that, this is not the Arab narrative of the Crusades. This is the European narrative of the Crusades that has been appropriated by the Arabs in the 20th century and then presented as if it is Arab, right? It's part of this kind of anti-colonial and independence and then struggle for Arab nationalism that you could see across. So yeah, this is not. If you want to look at the Arab perspective, then let's go and read the Arabic sources. that give us an extremely complicated. So yeah, the Al Jazeera wants to frame it in a modern conversation that pitted Arabism versus Islamism, and this has its origin in the what you call the modernization of the Arab world.
Hi, I'm Sonia Drimmer. I'm very loud. My question sort of follows up on what Cecilia was asking, but it puts everyone, it's to everyone who's participated today, it puts everyone a little bit on the spot. It's inspired by, Matthew, your talk regarding the clash of the so-called clash of the civilizations. In 1218, Henry III, so England was the first to implement the Fourth Lateran Council's mandate, or recommendation, let's call it, that Jews and Muslims be differentiated visually. And that, so in England, it was a badge, and that was placed on Jews. And it was reissued multiple times over the 13th century before the expulsion. One of those times was 1253. I think it's around the time that we think the Chertsey tiles are being made. And so the question that I have is, and I'm going back now to Betsy's talk, I believe it was Betsy's, that showed a document from the Cairo Geniza that showed, I think it was Abraham the Jew, I think it was providing some sort of materials, or I can't quite remember the contents of that. But my question sort of to everyone who's participated is, what would this story look like if we might incorporate objects that we know have some sort of relationship to Near Eastern Jews, into this story, or the story of Jews living in England at this time, and how might that also disrupt this dyadic clash of civilizations that we know is a false narrative? So I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that.
I'll just start.
I'm going to go back to my seat.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, we often forget, people who study the Crusades, that the first act of crusading violence that was perpetrated in 1095 was against the Jews of the Rhineland. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, it's still kind of in Crusades historiography, kind of excised and kind of written off. That's the whole reason I think this idea of the People's Crusade was begun, is to say this is an aberration of justified violence against the Muslims, when it was very much part of the ideology, it seemed, of these Crusaders, and I don't think it means to be marginalized. And not just kind of, and so to kind of follow up on this is just, it's not even just Near Eastern Jews, it's European Jews as well, who are the subject of violence and part of every, or made a part of, I should say, every crusading expedition that was launched, right? Mm-hmm. That violence against the Jews accompanies that. So we do need to absolutely bring them into part of the story, and this is something I'm absolutely guilty of in my own writing in the past as well. So.
Yeah. So thank you, Sonia. We're
retreating back here. Expand on that.
So I don't know if a lot of people know, but we tried really hard before we put up the wall texts and for this exhibition to talk to members of different faith communities in Worcester. And one of the strongest comments that I got was from a woman from Worcester Interfaith who said, you need to think about the Jews. Mm-hmm. And so I did. I went back and I learned, and, this bodies of the murdered Jewish family in Norwich, with toddlers stuffed down the well. That's how I introduced my introductory lecture here at Holy Cross when I was trying to get people on campus to think about what's going on here. And one of the important points that I learned and have been trying to communicate to my students is that, and of course, most of you in here will say, of course, but when medieval Christians are thinking, they're thinking about medieval Christians versus unbelievers. So they have very confused and mingled ideas about what it is to be a Muslim, what it is to be a Jew, what it is to be all these other things. And so basically their category is you're Christian or you're not. And we see that in the tiles, actually, that the identifier of otherness is the peaked cap that also gets used for Jewish people. So there's a kind of us versus them polarization going on, but it's us in this little small group, and then it's everybody else outside, which to me I find really interesting.
Can I jump with some remark apropos of this? Obviously, I come as a historian of the Islamic tradition, and this is what I work on. And part of my argument, obviously, is that we should really get rid of this, not only clash of civilization, but reducing the Crusade as a struggle between Muslims and European Christians, because definitely, the Jews were one of the communities that were extremely impacted and suffered from this. There is also Oriental Christians who were extensively, it's not only 1204, it's throughout that period, most of the people who lived under Frankish rule were Oriental Christians, and experience left tremendous legacy, tremendous impact there. So I think the conversation has to pass into the different, really, communities that got to be impacted by this, how the interactions went, and therefore that also helps us get rid of this kind of binary of clash of civilization, Islam versus Christianity, because for all practical purposes, you can introduce a new line in Crusader studies about Christian violence. And this is not only unique to the Orient, obviously in Europe itself, there was tremendous level of Christian violence that was fueled by that. So yeah, if we want to talk only of violence, there is plenty of complexities that we can add that makes reducing it to a clash between Muslims and Muslims so bizarre and so absurd. Right? So it's very important to remind ourselves that there are so many other communities that were extremely impacted by this.
Thank you, first of all. I just have a very generic question. Like, we often look at the Crusades, the inter-religious conflict within the community, but I just want to ask, how did the non-European, East Asia or Oriental perspective look at the Crusades at that time? Was it a similar response or different? And, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody know, for instance, what was?
What I would be interested to know, that your question generated, would be if there's any reflection in, for example, Mongol diplomatic letters to the nature of the conflict, to Holy War, for example. There is a famous letter from one of the Mongol Khans to the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, where he points out that the sultans of Egypt at that time were themselves Turks from Central Asia who had been enslaved and then became sultans, to make a long story short, but had reached the area of the Mediterranean because they themselves were fleeing the Mongols. So they were. He mocked the sultans of Egypt as cowards who had become enslaved, and reminded them of their flight, and that as the Mongol Khan put it, or as the minion writing the letters put it, ours is to hunt, yours is to be pursued. Very intimidating, but it showed a level of knowledge and interpretation of the Mamluks' political state. It would be very interesting to know, if not having read them myself, although they certainly exist, Mongol discourse on Frankish ideas of what they were doing in the East. Very good question. Thank you for that.
I think we could also use Scott Redford here to
Yeah.
speak about Anatolia, the relationships between the Franks and the Seljuks.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that is also along those lines where there sort of there's a love-hate thing going on between the Franks and the Seljuks.
Yeah, Richard, listen, I just wanted to pick up on, I think, what Ava and this other commentator were saying. And one of the wonderful places to look for that is in Armenian art of the middle of the 13th century. And our colleague Lisa Mahoney, who is at DePaul, who is a good friend of mine, has written on the Taurus Rosslyn Gospels that are in the Walters Art Museum. And there's a wonderful image there that's based on a parable that rarely gets illustrated. And the sort of the evil king there, before whom the apostles are going to have to go and testify truth and so on, is depicted as a Mongol, or at least with Mongol sort of a caricature of what they thought that the Khan would look like at the time. And the reason why I stood up to point this out is because he's wearing textiles with the kind of designs that were shown both by Betsy and was it Naomi earlier today, and that seems to be such a wonderful intersection of these kind of material and iconographic things, but also, as you were saying, it's so complicated by the time you get around to the 14th century because the Armenians are teaming up with I guess the Cypriot rulers and stuff like this, and the Mamluks and the Mongols are all talking to one or fighting one another, and the alliances are so fluid. It just, I think, underscores what Suleiman is saying about how these sort of binaries are just useless when you're looking at, especially with a single object like that, to elucidate it. It's not going to help to think that way. Thanks.
And especially when you think of the Crusaders in the Holy Land for 200 years, you know, who are they marrying? Who are their children? What's the reality on the ground?
What they are eating.
Yes, exactly, yes, yes.
So I think we have time for one more question. So, and we have one person. So there you go.
Thank you. Michael Davis, Mount Holyoke College. I wonder what kind of a two-part a comment or a reaction to the question about the Mongols. I wonder if the imagery of the World Chronicles of Rashid al-Din speak to this. You know, in some ways, the Mongol appetite as an equal opportunity conqueror, absorbing, you know, imagery, illustrating, you know, Muslim history. Again, the infamous recent event at Hamlin University in which an image of the Prophet was shown, and, you know, much to the, what I guess, professional ruin of the professor, is obviously the Mongols had a different attitude toward imagery than Orthodox Muslims know.
One copy of that, I believe, of the Chronicle of Rashid ad-Din famously has illustrations of the popes.
Right. And Buddha and, you know, the...
Actually, it's absolute fallacy that Islam bans imagery. There is some kind of objection to the representation, obviously, of God.
Right.
That is something you could say that throughout the Islamic tradition, we don't see at all representation of God. But when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad, there is varieties of choices of representations. Some would show the features, and there is no actually school that would ban outright that. Ultimately, in the Arab world, there emerges some kind of a dislike for the Prophet Muhammad's visual representation of his face details. So what you ended up having, but it's not unique to Rashid ad-Din, it's not unique to the Mongols. There were actually, I shouldn't judge them, but there was a Swiss couple who used to travel in the 1970s in the Muslim world, from Pakistan all the way to Morocco, and their fascination was to collect postcards. And they have close to 2,000 postcards. Probably, if I'm not, I don't know exactly, a colleague of mine at Michigan, she knew the couple and she actually got to see that. I'm not sure if it's 100 or several postcards for the Prophet Muhammad that up till the late 70s were sold in markets in some of the Arab world, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Turkey, in Tunis. Definitely, Iran is a big deal. And something happens in the late 70s, early 80s, and all of these postcards, you don't see them anymore. Okay? So there is a modern projection back about Islam's understanding of imagery.
Although
that
I
we
would
have
say
to take
it's a
into
complex issue, even you know, in the Middle Ages, that it seems to be a very fluid kind of.
You know,
I mean,
people didn't know how to do that.
You know,
right?
legal scholars weigh in on this about saying it may be better not to, but you know, without banning.
You know, the problem with legal scholars is that this is a voice, and then you have Rashid ad-Din doing illustrations, and so many others doing, right? You know, we know that Shiite mosque used to have illustrations of the Prophet, of the of Ali, of the Imams. In West Africa, I show it to some students. Ahmadou Bamba is one of the greatest saints, and people pray in front of his image. And one of the students objected, these are Muslims are pagans because they pray to the image. No, they don't pray to the image. This is a saint, right? They pray through the image, very much like, and you have to understand what's the function of the image. So we can't really judge on the basis of one view that say it's legalistic or etc. Because it represents a view, but it's not indicative the fact that imagery has been produced and consumed on a large scale. And by the way, Rashid ad-Din was not writing to the Mongols who were heathens. He was writing this book to the Mongols that just converted to Islam. Right? So we shouldn't forget that. Actually, they converted to Shi'ism, which fueled more problems later on.
So I think we're going to wrap it up, but before we do so, Amanda wants to give us some info and close things.
Thank you, Sahar. So I was just going to say, let's go have drinks, but it turns out I have a little bit of something I want to say before we do that. And the thing that I want to say is about fragments, and I'm grateful to Paul Cobb for bringing this concept, and then of course also to Betsy for bringing up this idea, and then of course the tiles for bringing up this idea. So fragments are, I think, a really nice way to think about not just the stuff, but also the way we engage with stuff. So fragments, parts of wholes, so much is gone, so much is missing, but something is left. All of art history is fragments. All of history is fragments. But the thing with fragments is that you can put them back together. And when you put them together, you realize your own agency, your own subjectivity, your own rootedness, right? Like I, as a person with my own interests and ideas, have to come up with some ways that I think these fragments make sense together. But also, when we put fragments together, we can do it together, right? Like it wasn't just me reassembling the tile mosaic. It wasn't, any single person. We are working as a community. And that, I think, brings me to where I want to close, which is that the way I see what we've done today is we worked as a community, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's been part of that community in all of your different ways, and speakers, moderators, audience, great questions, great discussion. So I'm going to close by thanking you, and then by saying, let's go get drinks. So it's up the...